Welcome, everybody. This is Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. Sorry. We are together today has Steve Russek, a friend of mine from the days of Allentown, Pennsylvania, where we both grew up. And so, Steve, welcome to the podcast. And maybe you can give us a little bit about your parents' background of pre-war through the camps, and then we'll take the podcast to some interesting other places.
Oh, Jeff, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So I'll begin my story by talking about my mother Dora, and so Dora was of blessed memory, was born in Grodno, Poland in 1923. She lived in a home with her parents, her brother, her youngest brother, a younger sister, and then an older sister, and her parents, Motel and Shana, and her sisters were Rachel and Fegala and Avram, and they lived on the banks of the Niemen River, which ran through the middle of Grodno. And she had a wonderful childhood. You know, it was really steeped in family and Jewish life, and the rhythm of Jewish life in Poland. And I think it's important to sort of have a perspective about Grodno. It was a town of maybe 50,000 people, 35,000 people, but it was just nominally, at the time of her birth, was nominally majority Jewish, which was not all that uncommon in Poland. And she tells great stories about her family. Her grandfather lived not far from her home. Her maternal grandfather Hirsch lived not far from her home, and he too lived on the banks of the Niemen River, and he was in the wood trade making shingles. And my mother had a great relationship with that side of the family as well as her father's, but her mother's side of the family used to make kayaks out of wood, and they used to do lots of things along the river, and she just had a wonderful time there. And her father's side of the family, my grandfather Mutzel, was a road construction foreman, as was his father, and some of the relatives on the Yablonec side of the family, my mother's side. And she had a wonderful time, and she really enjoyed, as she got older, going to school, going to Tarbut, the Hebrew language school, where they learned in Hebrew and Yiddish, and things went pretty well. It was a pretty good, comfortable existence, and Poland was reborn after the First World War, and it was a model. It was intended to be a model multi-ethnic country, and that went on pretty well until the early 1930s, when General Pilsudski, who was sort of the visionary for modern Poland, died, and the economic situation started getting really bad, and with it came an onset of anti-Semitism. Her father was having greater difficulty getting work. And by the time she was an adolescent in 1935, there was a terrible pogrom in Grodno. And one individual died, many people were injured. Her grandfather, as I mentioned, who lived on the banks of the Niemen, her grandfather Hirsch, my great-grandfather, he was badly beaten, and his children, his male children, they hid in the river and the like. And my grandfather Motel was in town doing business at the city hall, getting permits, and luckily he was befriended by, he had a good friend who worked there, a Pole, who was a very good friend of his, and he took my grandfather and stuck him in the basement of the city hall over there during the pogrom. And my mother and the rest of the family were holed up with all the Jewish men of the community, and essentially protected themselves with, rocks and shovels and rakes and whatever things they could, and managed to keep the rioters at bay. So it was a pretty pretty severe trauma, and came with this was there were beginnings of economic boycotts against Jews, and my grandfather was having a hard time making a living. And as a result, my mother could no longer go to school. They couldn't afford to send her. And it really, that left a very indelible mark on my mom. And she really committed that, when she has children, she was going to do anything she could to make sure they got a great education. And I think the testament to that is that, I went on to get a PhD, my sister went on to get a PhD, and my brother was an attorney. So, that was a really important thing to my mother and my father, that their children were educated. And I think she saw that as a major accomplishment for herself. And I think it was well deserved. They sacrificed a lot to make sure that kids got educated. So, coming towards the end of the 1930s, in 1939, when in September 39, when the war starts, the Soviets occupy Poland with the advent of the Ribbentrop Agreement, and so the Soviets have come in, and the situation got bad, but not horrible. Compared as when my mother tells this story, she always compares it to what happened later. But there was the economic times were difficult. It was hard to scrounge food. My great grandfather Hirsch once again had good connections with the peasants in the community, and a good reputation with them, and he was able to get food for the family. They had a little bit more means, and that it wasn't ideal, but it was okay for them. I think other folks who other Jews in Grodno who might have owned businesses were taken off to Soviet, off to the Gulag and into central Poland. My mother remembers Jews that were fleeing from the German occupied zone, and the Jews of Grodno made an effort to help them, and then the Russians sort of took them off east to the east, and so it was a pretty challenging situation. And in what is it in June of in June of 41, the Germans attacked, and they attacked their Soviet allies, so to speak, and they occupied Grodno, and the situation was just absolutely horrible. I managed on YouTube to find a video of the Germans entering Grodno, crossing the Yemen River in a bridge. And it was quite remarkable because the bridge was only 50 yards from my mother's house. And my mother remembers crossing that bridge by foot just hours later, and how horrendous that experience was. And so, she, as the Germans occupied Grodno, the acts of terror and humiliation and seizing of their property, and individual beatings and mass murder began to take place with greater number. Eventually, this all turned into they were later interned in the two ghettos, ghetto number 1 and ghetto number 2. And my mother ended up in ghetto number 1 with her family. And luckily, there was a family that had an apartment there that my parents knew, and they welcomed in. So, it was a couple of room apartment, a couple of families living there, but, they made do. That's what they did. And they lived in the ghetto, and my mother was sort of, in a way, fortunate enough to be picked for slave labor in a rag factory just outside the ghetto. And she and a number of other Grodno women worked there, and the person who ran the place was a Volksdeutsch, a German, someone who was a cultural German, wasn't from Germany, and he was pretty kind to them. She always remarked about that, and she was able to get food that came in with the rags smuggled in, and she smuggled it into the ghetto at great risk to herself. And then by the time the ghetto was started to be liquidated in November of 42, towards the end of that November, they were taken. My parents' family, my mother's family and her grandparents as well were taken to the Kelbasin transit camp. And from this transit camp, Jews were taken by train to either Auschwitz, Birkenau, or to Treblinka. And this is right around the time of Hanukkah in 1942 in December. And my grandfather Muttel made arrangements with his brother Velvel, and he sent his Velvel sent his son Shaiki to come and take my mother and escape from the camp. And so my mother reluctantly, just she says goodbye to her parents, and she wants to take her younger brother Avram with him, and my grandfather Muttel will not allow her, because she said, if you take Avram, you'll never survive. There's no chance. And so they had a very difficult parting, as you can imagine. And the last words my grandfather told to my mother was, my brother Chaim, who lives in America, he will be your new father. And as I tell when I recount this story for others, this Chaim Yablonik was actually, when he came to America, he was Herman Yablokov, who was the composer of Papa Rosen. And so he was this very well-known figure of the Yiddish theater in the Yiddish world internationally, whether in the U.S. and Canada and Argentina, and the Jewish diaspora pre-state Israel. So, and then so then my mother escapes with Shaiki, and they unfortunately the next morning, after all the transports have left, they get captured, and they're captured by Rinsler, who is the commandant of Kelbasin. And he keeps them. He separates the men and the women, and he keeps all the women in a bunker, in a cabin. And for the next 5 days, he periodically goes in and has them come out of the bunker and counts off every fifth woman, and he puts a bullet through their head. And so she endured all that. I don't know how. And eventually she survives that, and she gets taken back to the Grodno ghetto. And while she's in the Grodno ghetto, she ends up in the home of her boyfriend, Lava Sokol. And so my mother's one of my mother's uncles that didn't get taken to Kelbasin, he arranges for my mother and Lovell to get married. And so they get married in the Grodno ghetto in December of 42, and they live there and just waiting to see what's going to happen. Little food, very horrible situation. And comes the end of January 1943, the deportations from Grodno to Auschwitz begin again. It was called the Auction of the 10,000. And my mother is taken to Birkenau, and she makes her way into the camp, and she gets there around the end of January, and she finds herself as a slave laborer in Birkenau. She was fortunate enough that she wasn't taken to the crematoria like her mother and sister and brother. My grandfather Muttel had gone to had managed to stay in the camp, and she knew that he was alive when she got there, but he dies sometime thereafter.
How old was she?
Sorry?
How old was your mom?
So my mother, this is 1943, so she's about 20 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your father is how old?
And my father at this point is 2 years older. He's 22. And so my mother works in a number of various commandos, like in a weaving commando, Also some senseless commandos in the beginning where people are asked to move rocks and from one place to another, just essentially mindless torture. And so she's continuing to work in the Weberei, in the weaving area, and then she gets selected to work in Canada at this point. So Canada was a commando or a section, if you will, of Birkenau, where people worked to sort the clothes of the people that were being murdered. And my mother was selected for this commando along with a number of other women from Grodno. And she goes there, and on one of the come in March of 1943, she's really getting very, very ill. She's beginning to suffer from dysentery and the like, and she's running a fever, and she's on the verge of just not having the will to live anymore. And she gets stopped as they're coming back into the camp from work one day. She's stopped by a bunch of SS officers, her and her group, and they start asking them, "What are you doing here?" And one of them comes up to her because she looks a little red and flushed. So he's wondering, and she says, "My leg hurts." And instead of saying that she's ready to die and being taken to block 25, where you're taken next, you go to block 25. It's the next stop on the way to the gas chambers and the crematoria. Instead, they send her to the infirmary, and this is insane. Most people don't know this, but there was actually an infirmary in Birkenau where they sent sick people. Most of the people went there that died. My mother was there for 6 weeks and then walked out. Just completely phenomenal. When she walked back into her bunk, the women walked away from her. They wouldn't go near her because they thought she was a ghost. Because who comes back from the infirmary? Anyhow, so she recovers, and there's a very religious woman whose name escapes me. My mother told me, who shared extra portions with my mother of her meager portions, so that my mother would have a better chance of survival. And so she regains her strength. She's selected. She returns to work at Canada, and then fast forwarding to like December of towards December of 43. She and other women of that were working in Canada are taken to the new location of Canada, which is, from the iconic picture that everyone knows from the aerial pictures of Birkenau. You have the two sections on either side where crematoria 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are present, and in between that is where Canada was. And she spends the period from 1943 into 45 working in Canada. And there are quite a number of stories that go with that, but not enough time to share them here. And she eventually come the January in 1945, with the Soviets soon approaching, and the Germans scared to death of the Soviets because they don't take prisoners. They're just either the prisoners they take, they're sending them to Siberia, and otherwise they're just killing them. And so my mother, with once again with a number of the same women from Grodno that she entered the camp with, they became her camp sisters, her Lagerschwestern. And they are taken on a death march. They're taken to Ravensbrück. First, they march through the snow. It's brutally cold. I don't know. I think it was like minus 20 C or something like this. It was really freezing, cold winter. And she's taken by open coal carrier towards the direction of Ravensbrück. And then they're taken out of the coal carrier and marched to Ravensbrück, where she's begins to be a slave laborer there. And then she spends some time in Malkov through, I think, like March or early May, or early April. And then eventually, with the Soviets getting closer, she's taken on a death march, and she she and the women are just going, they're just marching endlessly to the south from Ravensbrück. And eventually one morning, it's maybe late April, early May, I forget the exact date. And they wake up in a field, and the Germans are all gone. And she's liberated. And they all the women try to figure out what to do, and they ask some people for some directions and the like. And they find out where the river is, and they are told the Americans are there, and they end up going to the banks of the river near Hausdorf, and they cross a tributary of the Elbe. And how did they cross? American soldiers swim across the river.
So let me
take them on their backs to freedom.
Pretty amazing. So let me, we have a few minutes left, but I do want to give you an opportunity to tell one or two of those stories. And then we're going to, this will be the first part of our podcast episode. We're going to do another podcast with you, right, as a continuation of your story. So tell us one or two of those stories.
So I think one of the there are two really I think very interesting stories. One is about hope, and the other one is about determination. So the one about hope is when my mother first entered the camp. This is going back to the time period around February of 1943. My mother is sharing a bunk with another woman named Dora. Her name is, I think her name when she was born was Dora Globowitz, and she later went by the name Dora Freilich. And I had the opportunity to, I was preparing to tell my mother's story, and I went to a talk given that was sponsored by the Holocaust Education Resource Center of Milwaukee. And the talk that day was being given by Elaine Culbertson. And Elaine is a well-known teacher of Holocaust education in the US. And Elaine tells a story about her mother's story of survival. And as she's going through this story of survival, my wife Myra is sitting next to me and whispering in my ear, "Steve, this story sounds like your mother's story. This story sounds like your mother's story." And we're just sitting there in amazement. And then so after that talk, I go up to talk to Elaine, and we have a short amount of time here, but making a long story short, it turns out that Elaine Culbertson is Dora Freilich's daughter.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so when my mother Dora and the other Dora Freilich, they shared a bunk together in Birkenau. And Dora Freilich gave testimony in I think it was like 1981 or 82 at Greats College. And in that story, in her testimony, she talks about breaking bread with my mother, how they would share. Yeah. How they would share, excuse me, how they would share bread in the morning and at night. They would share their little portion. And they would, my mother would share with her that that we should be hopeful, that when we survive, my uncle in America will help us. And excuse me, that story was, I think left such a strong impact on Dora Freylock. Her daughter Elaine said her mother used to sing Papa Rosen all the time.
How does
So
that song go?
sorry.
Do you know how that song goes?
Oh, I can't. I'm sorry. It's a song about an orphan child, an orphan boy selling cigarettes in World War I Poland. It was popularized by my uncle Herman Yablokov, who had a stage persona called the Der Payac, the clown. He was sort of like a David Bowie character of the 1930s.
So you know a ton about your family's Holocaust story. So was your mother very had the ability to share with you?
Yes.
How do you gather all of this information? No, I'm going to give you the opposite side of this. My mother, who was in Auschwitz with her family, and my father, who escaped Nazi Germany at 15, did none of that sharing. I know nothing from my mother or my father about their survival. And they only wanted to look forward to the future. So tell me, how could your mother, and I know from my doing what I'm doing, is that there were a lot of survivors talked, and there are many that didn't talk.
Yes.
There were some hybrid in the middle. But
absolutely,
it sounds like your mother needed to speak to you about, and then let's talk about your father. Did your father also have the experience of talking?
Not so much, but I also have to say that my father was a very intense introvert. So I would say that the only person I ever met in my life that was more introverted than my father was his brother Yaakov. So my dad Shimon
you have your mom's extrovert, right?
That is correct. I have my mom's extroversion, and so I can't entirely remember when it started, but I think my mother had a knack of telling stories that were age appropriate, and so she drew me into the. I think she drew me into the stories appropriately, leaving, the horror and the trauma and the violence, which I learned about later when I was better able to handle it. And I think,
when the first time you heard something about the Holocaust?
oh boy, I would 8 years old, 7 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think, did it leave a mark on me? Yeah. Some kids play, some kids when they're home alone or they're hanging out in their room, they play cards or solitaire. Sometimes I would set up a little fort hiding underground, hiding from Nazis, so what am I supposed to say? It's so it had.
We're going to talk more about that, but we're coming close to the end of our first episode of talking with you, Steve.
Yes.
So I'm going to leave it here, and then we're going to come back to our second episode. And in just a minute, you're listening to Steve Russek tell his family story, which is really incredibly emotional. And I think all of us have felt your story as you've explained it.
Thank you.
And so we're going to come back to episode 2 of Steve's story and for the Obligation of Memory podcast shortly.
Thanks.